Funding for Poets and Their Craft on Vermont PBS is provided by Phoenix Books, with stores in Burlington, Rutland, and Essex, Vermont. Phoenix Books, supporting our communities in everything we do, from books to authors. Details and information at phoenixbooks.biz. Vermont College of Fine Arts, located in Montpelier, fosters the excellence of established and emerging writers, designers, artists, composers, teachers, and filmmakers through its graduate-level programs. Learn more at vcfa.edu. Northshire Bookstores, fostering discovery and serendipity for babies to the ageless, committed to building community one book at a time, with locations in Manchester, Vermont, and Saratoga Springs, New York, and Middlebury Breadloaf School of English and Breadloaf Writers Conferences attract emerging and established faculty, students, and writers from around the country, a summer tradition for more than 90 years.
Hello, I'm Mary Jane Dickerson. David Budbill's work stands alone in a class by itself, in its mix of both the special and the ordinary. Whether from the zen of his poems filled with nature, or from the heart-wrenching scenes in his plays, the images and music of his work leave us emotionally charged and changed. In his work, we find the creativity, independence, and perseverance that may define Vermont. But David uses these attributes to transcend place and time. We listened to him at Galaxy Bookshop in Hardwick as he talked about poetry, special or ordinary. But first, co-owners Sandy Scott and Andrea Jones talked about the importance of poetry.
Poetry is a reflection of the beauty that we're surrounded by the amazing people that live in Vermont, and by that need to some time of the year go inward and be reflective.
And there's something, I think, in the brevity of poetry that might appeal to Vermonters as well. You say a lot in a small amount of words.
There is a war going on in American poetry, and nobody wants to admit it. It's a war between plain-speaking poets and others, and the ones who believe poetry is made of a secret language that only a few have access to. I recently heard Sid Lee, Poet Laureate of Vermont, say the same thing in an interview on Noontime Edition on Vermont Public Radio. I also heard Terry Gross interview Jacqueline Woodson, author of Brown Girl Dreaming, the National Book Award for Young People, People's Literature for 2014, a book written all in verse. And Terry said, with what seemed to me like great surprise in her voice, it's actually easier to read than if it were in prose. Is it a knot to be untangled, or simply a story to be told? I vote with those who simply tell stories. What's wrong with that? Not complex and enigmatic enough? Poetry should at least be as clear as prose, Robert Lowell, of all people, said once within my hearing. It's easier to read than if it were in prose. The line breaks actually help you read it. There's a reason, it turns out, why the lines don't make it to the right-hand side of the page. They help clarify the meaning of the sentence. Here's a very famous quote from W.H. Auden. He said once, if two poets came to him, and one said he wanted to write because he had truths to tell, and one said he loved language, the one who loved language would be the poet. On the other hand, here is my favorite quote from Alden Nolan, a Canadian poet from the Maritimes. When you read my poems, forget about the words. Words mean nothing to me. What concerns me is the unutterable loneliness of the human heart. He said, "Words mean nothing to me." Can you imagine any American poet or any other poet from anywhere saying such a thing? Why does language have such a hold on poets? My buddy, Joel Oppenheimer, now dead, used to say, poetry is not about language. It's about something. As Grace says in Judavine, both those things. God damn it, not just one. Only current political points of view about literature set up a hierarchy. In today's academic poetry, climate for poetry, personal poetry is superior to political poetry. And political poetry is considered propaganda, inferior, which of course it not always was. When Pablo Casals was famously refusing to play his cello in public as long as Generalissimo Franco was in power, Albert Schweitzer came to Casals and said, it's better to create than to protest. To which Casals responded, why not do both? Why not create and protest both? Here's a poem from my book, Moment to Moment. Pow, chow, and now. I'm sick of everyone playing the World Series of poetry with poets now and in ancient China, saying undoubtedly the two greatest poets in Chinese were Tu Fu and Li Po. Phooey! There were hundreds of wonderful poets, thousands of wonderful poems, then as now. Why are we always trying to decide who is the greatest, the best, the first? For example, have you ever heard of Pao Chao? He lived and wrote in the wrong time, after Tao Chen and before the Tang. Almost nobody knows him. His poems are lost in a dark age between the so-called great writers. Yet his poems are there for anybody to read, bitter, loving, heartfelt, and sad, with sweetness and regret. Things come attached with a form when they emerge in me or from me, from someplace. Where that is, I don't know. There's a form attached to them. The form emerges with the piece, which is not the same as I already know. I don't like to read. I mean, reading is so difficult for me, I don't like doing it. I'm learning disabled, and in a lot of ways. I never read fiction because it's too hard, too many words, and when I read so slowly, I get incredibly frustrated by so many words on a page, and the page is so full of words, all of which is why I like poetry best. There are fewer words. When reading poetry, you're supposed to read slowly. Stop and think. And you realize, you visualize, you step inside the poem. Go ahead, move your lips. You can't speed read poetry. You've got to read it slowly. Go ahead, do what you're never supposed to do with prose. Move your lips, phonate, read it out loud. After all, poetry is made for the ear more than the eye anyway. This makes it a perfect medium for learning disabled people like myself. You have to honor the language, each word, its position in relation to the others, the method by which the poem is put together, and the writer who put it together. In order that to do this, you've got to go slowly. Poetry offers nuggets, kernels, little knots of intense imagery, a vivid moment of clarity about an instant in this world. Little lyrics that accumulate into a narrative, either consciously telling a story or unconsciously revealing a life. In the best cases, this is not an egomaniacal Too many poets stick it in our faces, but rather something more in the ancient Chinese style, where a poet sees himself, herself, as so much like everyone else, so common, ordinary, so in touch with the species' feelings that what they see, hear, feel has got to be what others see, hear, and feel also. I don't like obtuse poetry. I don't like John Ashbery's poetry. For example, I don't care how many awards he gets or who thinks he's a great poet. I just don't like it. I like Hayden Carruth, Wendell Berry, Amiri Baraka, Grace Paley, Galway Connell, Gwendolyn Brooks, Lucille Clifton, Olaf Hauge, poets who are committed to making clear English sentences that are not difficult to understand. The concept within the sentence may be difficult, but the sentence itself is not. This desire to be deliberately obscure has always been with us. Every writer needs to decide whether he or she wants to be striking and new, what an NEA grant reader called quirky, odd power of poetry, or whether she wants to do what Grace Paley said. We want to be understood. It doesn't have to be complicated to have a complicated message. It has to communicate something as directly as it possibly can. I don't want to be deliberately obscure. Life, like I said, life is difficult enough. Don't add to the confusion. I still like reading poetry best, or listening to it, such as every morning on NPR's The Writer's Almanac. Novels have just too many words on the page. They go on forever. Poetry, on the other hand, gets up there, does its job with a minimum of words and fuss, belts it out, gets it over with, and sits down. I like that. Here's 3 of the illustrations of what I'm talking about from my own works. All of us. Out of the undifferentiated Tao come the 10,000 things. The bug in the bird's mouth. The bird in the tree outside the window beyond the chair in the room, and the man in the chair, who has just now risen from the chair and walked across the room to look out the window at the bird in the tree with the bug in its mouth. See how all of us, at our own indifferent speeds, return to the Tao. Oh, let us all sing praises now, for all of us so briefly here. And a second, bugs in a bowl. Han San, that great and crazy, wonder-filled Chinese poet of 1,000 years ago, said, we're just like bugs in a bowl, all day going around, never leaving their bowl. I say, that's right. Every day climbing up the steep sides and sliding back. Over and over again, around and around, up and back down. Sit in the bottom of the bowl, head in your hands, cry, moan, feel sorry for yourself. Or look around, see your fellow bugs, walk around. Say, how you doing? Say, hey, nice bowl. And finally, tomorrow, we are bones and ash, roots of weeds poking through our skulls. Today, simple clothes, empty minds, full stomach, alive, aware, right here, right now. Drunk on music, who needs wine? Come on, sweetheart, let's go dancing while we've still got feet. Phrase comes to me out of somewhere, I don't know where, and it starts a poem, or an image starts a poem, or something I've heard starts a poem, and I take it from there. I make myself available to the muse, if you want to call her that. Poems should be the way Olaf Hauge said Bertolt Brecht's verse was. Handy to step into. It should be on the door step, like a pair of wooden clogs. Open the poet's door. Put on the wooden clogs. Step into his house. Come in. Make a cup of tea. Sit down. Open the book. Enter his life. I have a checkered history with academic poetry, academic institutions. Being an egalitarian that I am, I have made a point of getting every grade offered from the highest to the lowest at every school I've ever entered. And since then, I've spent my life trying to stay away from academic institutions and academic poetry. I'm a writer, but I have always been somewhat embarrassed about being a writer, an artist. I don't like the elite and elitist air that often casts itself over artists and the arts. It's obvious that many people involve themselves with the arts in order to distinguish themselves from the common people out of which I come and with whom I still fiercely identify. I'm interested in the invisible people, the ordinary, the downtrodden, the put upon, and the forgotten. I hate pretense. I want to make art and the common people that the common people can understand, use, find meaningful, and enjoy. All this may explain why I firmly believe that poetry is for ordinary people and why my writing is so plain and simple and easy to understand. In fact, a poem in one of my books called On the Road to Buddhahood explains this. Ever plainer, ever simpler, ever more ordinary. My goal is to become a simpleton. And from what everybody tells me, I am making real good progress. It's pretty hard to be in Vermont and be arrogant. It's not, well, help me out, Jeff. Yeah. Lois, maybe.
I'm arrogant, so I...
Yeah, right.
I also feel like, you know, the whole movement to, right now with spoken word poetry and poetry slams, how that doesn't seem to be accepted by the academia.
Yeah, that could be.
And so there, to me, it feels like a real division, the division you're talking about as far as.
Yeah, that's quite possible. You're sitting in front of the slam champ of Vermont.
Yeah.
Well, I will only say that I think many people who do not feel like performing their poems are still darn good poets. And that ascribing it to a split in academia and the shoot from the hip poets, that I think was what Hayden used to call you.
Rough and ready.
You're rough and ready, that's it.
Right.
I'm not sure that split is along academic lines as much as it is those of us who are not afraid to get on stage and others who really believe their work is maybe too tender to just be, when you're reading, as you say, you slow down and you go back. In a performance, it's a one-time shot.
Yeah, that's true.
Will you talk about how your work has changed since Barking Dog?
Will I talk about it?
Yeah, what are the changes
no.
that you know of?
Oh, man. Well, I think the biggest change is that has to do with Hayden. Because when I came here, I was writing, and this was after Barking Dog, which was my first book, which was before I came to Vermont. I was writing a very delicate, nature poetry. And I was writing sonnets that rhymed at both ends of the line and so forth. And Hayden said, "Oh, this is all very nice, but it doesn't sound like you. It doesn't sound like you. It's not funny," for example. And I couldn't disagree. And one day I went out to my cabin, and I had been a newspaper reporter, and I rolled some paper into my typewriter. This was back in the days of typewriters. And I started typing a poem on a typewriter. And that was significant to me because it's what I did in the city room at the newspaper. And I started writing a poem called According to Armin, which was the first name of the guy who became Antoine in Judavine. And it was all because of Hayden. And I started, and the line got quite prosy and long and lopey and funny, and off I went into a whole new style. And it was because of Hayden, primarily. Oh, and also because of William Carlos Williams, in an interview I'd heard that night on the CBC, an hour and a half. Can you imagine an American radio station doing an hour and a half on William Carlos Williams' interview? Williams was talking about the American language versus the English language, and how we spoke American, not English, and how we had to start speaking American, not English. And I listened to that. Anyway, that's what started me off.
The wonderful thing about writing poems is that you can decide where each line ends. And in prose, you can't do that.
That's right, you can't.
And you're creating something visual rather than just a rectangular block of gray.
Will you go with me every time? My theory is it comes out that way. I mean, it emerges from my soul or being with a form attached, so I don't have anything to do with it. You buy that? I'm a working class kid. I grew up, my father was a streetcar driver and my mother was a housewife. It's hard for me to be arrogant about being a poet because poetry for me is kind of embarrassing. I mean, I don't feel a connection to those people. I feel a connection to the people, which are, so in a way I'm at cross purposes with myself. I'm embarrassed because it's an elite occupation, and or at least it is in most people's minds. And I don't feel elitist about it at all.